There are forests in America where the shadows feel heavier, where the silence is not just silence but something waiting. Locals whisper warnings passed down for generations. Never walk alone after sunset. Never stay the night if you hear voices in the trees. And above all, never answer when someone calls your name from the darkness. Tonight, I want to take you deep into those places, into the Ozark Mountains, the Ouachita forests, the remote slopes of the Black Hills, and the endless woods of Allegheny. Places that hold stories not written in history books, but etched in the memories of those who barely escaped alive. These are not legends. These are not ghost stories told around campfires. They are true accounts from people who swear by what they saw, what they felt, and what they will never forget. 5 stories. 5 encounters that remind us one terrifying truth. In the wilderness, you are never truly alone. So sit back, turn down the lights, and remember, the next sound you hear might not come from your own house. Story 1. The Woman on the Peninsula. It was supposed to be just another summer weekend. A group of friends, 4 of them, all in their 20s, had decided to camp near Table Rock Lake, deep in the Ozark Mountains. The lake was wide, calm, and almost beautiful in the fading light. The kind of place you'd imagine roasting marshmallows, drinking cheap beer, and telling harmless, scary stories around a fire. That first evening, everything was perfect. They set up their tents on a flat patch of ground near the shore, cooked hot dogs over the flames, and laughed until the stars came out. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the gentle splash of water against the rocks. But sometime after midnight, things changed. One of them, Jeremy, was the first to notice movement on the far side of the lake. Across the water, there was a narrow peninsula that jutted out, a dark strip of land barely visible in the moonlight. Jeremy swore he saw a figure there. At first, he thought it might be another camper, maybe someone out fishing late. Then came the scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you laugh off or chalk up to coyotes. It was sharp, human, and carried across the still water with terrifying clarity. A woman's voice, high and desperate, echoing into the night. The group froze. No one spoke. They just stared at the peninsula. And sure enough, they saw him. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, walking along the edge of the rocks. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he wasn't in any hurry. Somebody whispered, "What the hell is he doing?" But no one had an answer. Then they heard it again. Another scream, closer this time. And the sound of someone running, feet pounding against dirt and stone. The friends could just barely make out a smaller figure, someone darting between the trees at the base of the peninsula. The man was chasing her. They wanted to call for help. They pulled out their phones, but the screen showed the same thing. For all of them, no service. They tried moving around, holding the phones up toward the sky, even climbing a rock for a better signal. Nothing. So they waited. Helpless. The chase seemed to go on forever, though in reality it might have been just a few minutes. Then the forest went silent again. No more screams. No footsteps. Just the sound of water lapping at the shore. Nobody slept that night. They kept the fire burning, sitting in a circle, watching the peninsula like hawks. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves set their nerves on fire. At dawn, as soon as the sun lifted, they packed up and drove until they finally got service. The first thing they did was call the police. When officers arrived, the friends led them back to the campsite and pointed across the lake. A search team was sent to the peninsula. For hours, there was nothing but silence. Then, sometime around noon, one of the deputies radioed in. They'd found something. Hidden in a shallow cave near the base of the rocks was a woman. Malnourished, terrified, barely able to speak. She had been missing for months. According to her, she hadn't just been held there. She had been hunted. The man who abducted her would sometimes release her into the woods at night, forcing her to run while he followed, just close enough for her to hear his footsteps. just close enough for her to feel his presence at her back. She said last night was different. He had let her out again, but she knew he meant to finish it. She screamed, hoping someone would hear. And by some miracle, the campers had. But the man? He was gone. By the time the police combed the area, he had vanished into the endless forest. No fingerprints, no tracks. Just an empty cave and a woman who would never forget the sound of his boots behind her. For weeks, the local news covered the story. They called him the Hunter of the Ozarks. Some swore he had been living in those woods for years, surviving off the land, waiting for his victims. And though the police searched, he was never caught. The friends never returned to Table Rock Lake. They said it wasn't just the memory of the screams that haunted them. It was the feeling of sitting there in the dark, with only a fire between them and that peninsula, knowing that somewhere in those trees, the man was still watching. Some nights when they tell the story, they swear they remember one last detail. Long after the screams had stopped, long after the forest went quiet, they thought they saw something. A flicker of movement, just at the edge of the trees. A tall figure, standing perfectly still, facing the lake. Facing them, and then it was gone. Story 2. The writer and the nightmare cabin writers often talk about the need to get away from everything noise, distractions, people, just to focus on their work. That's what Michael thought he needed. He was a 32-year-old novelist, struggling with a deadline and with his own doubts. So when a friend told him about a cheap little cabin up in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas, he jumped at the chance. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, nothing but trees and silence. Perfect, he thought. Exactly the kind of isolation that might unlock his creativity. The cabin itself was simple. A single bedroom upstairs, a kitchen and living room downstairs, and a wraparound porch that looked out into the woods. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, stocked with firewood, and had that rustic charm he thought would inspire him. The first day passed peacefully. He unpacked, made coffee, scribbled a few notes in his journal, and watched the sun set behind the mountains. He fell asleep early, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep you only get when you're far away from the city. But around 2 in the morning, he woke up. At first, he thought it was just a dream, one of those half-dreams where you're awake but not fully aware. He couldn't move, couldn't even lift his head. His body was heavy, frozen, pinned to the bed as if invisible hands were holding him down. He tried to scream, but nothing came out. All he could do was breathe, shallow and fast. And then he heard it, a metallic sound, faint but distinct, coming from underneath the bed, like nails dragging across steel, or the edge of a knife scraping against iron. Slow, deliberate, the sound circled beneath him, moving from one side to the other, then pausing. He could feel the vibrations through the mattress. He forced himself to close his eyes, counting the seconds, waiting for it to stop. When at last the weight lifted from his body, he sat up gasping, drenched in sweat. The room was empty, silent. He checked under the bed with a flashlight. Nothing, just dust and wood. By morning, he told himself it had been sleep paralysis, stress, exhaustion. Nothing more. The second night, it happened again. This time, the metallic sound was followed by something worse. The closet door creaked open. Slowly, a thin line of darkness widening until he could see the empty space inside. Except it wasn't empty. 2 eyes, reflecting light, like an animal's, low to the ground, staring at him through the gap. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He just stared back, frozen, until his body finally released him and he lunged for the lamp. The light filled the room. The closet was empty. He didn't sleep after that. He sat on the edge of the bed with every light on, watching the closet door, until the sun came up. By the third night, he was exhausted. His hands shook as he made coffee, and he barely touched his notebook. He wanted to leave, but something in him resisted stubbornness, maybe pride. He told himself he could handle one more night, That was his mistake. Around midnight, the familiar heaviness pinned him down. But this time, it wasn't just the sound under the bed or the eyes in the closet. It was footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, climbing the wooden staircase that led up to the bedroom. Each creak echoed in the silence. Closer, closer. He tried to scream, tried to move, but his body betrayed him again. All he could do was listen as the steps reached the landing. Then they stopped. The doorway was empty, but he could feel that someone was there, just out of sight, watching. The silence stretched on. Then came the sound of breathing, slow, deep, inhaling, exhaling, inches from his bed. When the paralysis finally released him, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his bag, ran down the stairs, and bolted into the night. He didn't even take his car at first. He just ran down the dirt road until his legs gave out. Only then did he force himself back to the cabin long enough to grab his keys and speed away, leaving the place unlocked, lights blazing. He never returned. Later, when he told the story, people offered explanations. Sleep paralysis, overactive, imagination, stress. Some said the cabin was just old, creaking with the night air, but Michael swore it wasn't a dream. He swore he had heard footsteps on the stairs. He swore he had felt the breath against his face. And the worst part? When he reached home and unpacked his bag, he found something he couldn't explain. At the very bottom, tucked between his notebooks, was a long, thin scratch across the leather cover. Fresh, as if something sharp had dragged across it in the dark. He keeps that notebook locked away now. And he doesn't write in cabins anymore, because he knows that sometimes the silence you seek in the wilderness isn't silence at all. Sometimes it's something waiting. Story 3. The strange family on the mountain. For years the cabin had been abandoned. Locals in the Black Hills of South Dakota called it a lost cause, a crooked wooden house with broken shutters, peeling paint, and a roof that sagged under the weight of too many winters. But for one man named David, it was a bargain. David had always dreamed of owning a place in the mountains. Somewhere quiet, somewhere removed from the chaos of city life. When he saw the listing online, a remote log cabin sitting on a few acres of land, he didn't hesitate. He bought it sight unseen. The first time he drove up the dirt road and laid eyes on the place, his excitement faltered. The house was rougher than the pictures suggested. The yard was overgrown, the porch warped, and every window seemed to watch him with a kind of emptiness. Still, he told himself he could fix it. That's what he wanted, a project, a retreat. It was only after a few days that he realized he wasn't alone. The cabin sat near a slope, and on the far side of the ridge lived another family. At first, he didn't know they were there. Then, one evening, while chopping wood, he noticed movement in the trees. A group of people, at least 7 or 8 standing just far enough away that he couldn't see their faces clearly. When he waved, none of them waved back. They just stood there, watching. Later, a neighbor in town told him about them. A strange family, locals said. An elderly couple and their 6 grown children. They lived off the land, rarely came into town, and never mingled with outsiders. People whispered about guns, about family rules, about how the children were all homeschooled and rarely spoke to anyone. David tried not to judge. Maybe they were just private. But he couldn't shake the way they looked at him, like he was trespassing. One night, he was sitting by the fire when he heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy ones. He froze. The door rattled, not like someone trying to force it, but like fingers dragging across the wood. When he yanked it open, no one was there. But in the dirt below, he saw them footprints. Several pairs. The next night, it was worse. He woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of whispers. At first, he thought it was wind in the trees. But when he peeked through the curtain, his stomach turned. The family was outside, all of them. The parents, the 6 grown children. They weren't talking loudly, just murmuring. walking slow circles around his cabin. Their flashlights cut through the trees, sliding across his windows, casting long shadows on the walls. But they didn't knock. They didn't break in. They just circled. The following morning, when David stepped outside, he found a dead rabbit on his porch. Its body torn open, its blood staining the wood. He called the sheriff. The deputy who came out didn't seem surprised. He just shrugged and said, "They've been up there forever. Best thing you can do is mind your business, and they'll mind theirs." But David knew that wasn't true. The family wasn't minding their business. They were testing him. Days passed. He changed the locks on every door. He nailed shut the windows in the back, but it didn't matter. Every morning, something was out of place. A chair pulled away from the table. A picture frame tilted. Once, he found the back door wide open, even though he remembered locking it before bed. The worst was the night he woke to creaking inside the house. Someone was in the cabin. He held his breath, listening. A slow shuffle across the kitchen floor. Then silence. He grabbed his flashlight and crept downstairs, heart hammering. The room was empty, but the back door stood open, swinging lightly. In the breeze, from the edge of the trees, he saw them again. The family, just standing there, their pale faces barely visible in the beam of his light. Watching, always watching. He shouted at them, demanded to know what they wanted. But they didn't answer. They just slipped back into the woods, their footsteps fading into the night. That was the last straw. The next morning, he packed his truck and drove into town, swearing he'd never spend another night there alone. He told the realtor he wanted to sell, but the man just laughed. Nobody would buy that cabin. Not anymore. David doesn't talk about it much these days. When he does, his voice gets low, almost like he's afraid someone might overhear. He says he doesn't know what the family wanted from him, if it was a warning, or a game, or something darker. All he knows is that they never crossed the line. They never broke the door, never laid a hand on him, and that's what scares him most, because it means they were choosing not to, which means one day they still could. Story 4. The couple escaping the stalker. Some nightmares don't come from ghosts or shadows in the woods. Sometimes, the thing that haunts you is another human being, someone who refuses to let go, no matter how far you run. For Anna, it started when she was 19. A man she barely knew, someone she had met once at a cafe, began showing up in her life. First it was friendly messages, then flowers on her doorstep, then long, unsettling emails about how they were meant to be together. At first, she ignored it, then she blocked him. But he always found a way back. A new email, a new phone number, a car idling across the street from her apartment. Years passed, and he never stopped. When Anna married her husband Daniel, she thought it might finally end, but it only made things worse. The stalker's messages grew darker, full of rage and jealousy. He seemed to know everything about them, where they worked, what car they drove, even when they planned vacations. It got so bad that Anna and Daniel decided to leave town for a while. They needed a place where no one could find them, not even him. That's how they ended up in a remote cabin, deep in the Adirondack mountains of New York. They planned carefully. They bought a used car under Daniel's name, took back roads instead of highways, and told no one where they were going. For the first time in years, Anna felt a flicker of peace. The forest was quiet, the air crisp, and the cabin, small but sturdy, felt like a fortress. For 3 days, it was perfect. They hiked trails, cooked simple meals, and sat by the fire, laughing like they hadn't in years. For the first time in so long, Anna thought maybe they had escaped. Then came the 4th day. They had gone for a long walk through the woods, and when they returned, something felt wrong. The air was still heavy. Anna noticed it first. Their car, parked beside the cabin, had its tires slashed. All 4 of them. Daniel swore under his breath and sprinted to the cabin. The front door was wide open. Inside, everything was chaos. Drawers pulled out, clothes thrown across the floor, cupboards emptied. Someone had been inside. Anna's stomach dropped. She didn't need to ask who. They barricaded themselves inside the cabin's only secure room, a reinforced safe room the owner had built years earlier. It had steel walls, a heavy lock, and a narrow slit of a window. They huddled inside, hearts pounding, trying to convince themselves they were safe. But safety didn't last long. It began with footsteps. Heavy boots crunching across the porch. Then the unmistakable sound of a man's voice, low and muttering to himself. They couldn't make out the words, but they could hear the tone calm, deliberate, like someone savoring every second. Then came the first gunshot. The blast echoed through the forest, shaking the thin walls. Splinters of wood rained from the front door as the intruder fired again and again, trying to break through. Anna clutched Daniel's hand so hard her nails dug into his skin. She could hear him breathing, steadying himself, whispering, "We'll get through this. Stay quiet. Don't move." The gunfire stopped. For a long, terrible minute, there was silence. Then came the smell of smoke. The man had set the cabin on fire. The flames spread fast, devouring the dry wood. Smoke poured under the door of the safe room, filling their lungs, stinging their eyes. Anna coughed, panic rising, until Daniel grabbed her hand and yanked her toward the far corner. The cabin had a secret. The realtor had mentioned it when they signed the lease. A hidden escape tunnel, built during Prohibition. The entrance was in the safe room, disguised beneath a loose panel in the floor. Daniel kicked it open, revealing a narrow shaft leading into the earth. The air smelled damp and moldy, but it was their only chance. They crawled through the tunnel. As the fire roared above them, their skin slick with sweat, lungs aching from the smoke. The tunnel ended at a rotting wooden hatch, which Daniel shoved open with all his strength. They emerged into an abandoned shed, half collapsed and covered in vines. Behind them, the cabin was an inferno, flames shooting into the night sky. And somewhere out there in the dark forest, the man was waiting. They didn't stop to look. They just ran. Through the trees, down the slope, following the faint glow of lights in the distance. It took hours, stumbling through the underbrush, but eventually they reached a small town. A diner, still open past midnight, where they collapsed. Inside and begged someone to call the police. The sheriff's department investigated. They found the cabin burned to the ground, nothing left but blackened beams and ash. No trace of the intruder. No fingerprints. No footprints. Nothing. Anna and Daniel didn't wait for answers. Within a week, they left the country, starting over. Somewhere far away, with new names and a new life. But even now, years later, Anna still checks over her shoulder. She still wakes in the night to imagine footsteps. Because the truth is, the man who hunted them is still out there. And the scariest part? He never said a word, not once. Not when he was shooting, not when he was burning the cabin. Not when he was pacing just outside their safe room, which means he might still be waiting, silent, patient, watching. Story 5. The friend named Elias. Some families inherit money. Others inherit land. And sometimes, what you inherit is something you wish had stayed buried forever. When Mark was a boy, his parents owned an old cabin deep inside the Allegheny National Forest of Pennsylvania. It had been in his mother's family for generations. The kind of place you'd expect to hold warm memories, summer fishing trips, winters by the fireplace. But for Mark, the cabin was not a place of comfort. It was the place where he first met Elias. Elias was not a neighbor. Elias was not a family friend. Elias was, according to Mark's little brother Tommy, his imaginary friend. Tommy was only 6 at the time, and kids that age often invent companions. At first, the parents thought nothing of it. Tommy would sit on the porch, whispering to someone no one else could see. He'd laugh suddenly, as though hearing a joke. He'd talk at the dinner table to an empty chair. But soon, the details grew darker. Tommy insisted Elias was always in the cabin, waiting for them when they arrived. He said Elias liked to play games, but he didn't like Mark. "Elias doesn't want you here," Tommy whispered one night before bed. Mark laughed it off at first. But then came the nights when he woke shivering, his body icy cold even under blankets. He would hear his brother's voice in the dark, giggling softly, and then Tommy would say, "Don't be scared. Elias is just playing with you." Their mother grew uneasy. One morning she found Tommy standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the banister as though preparing to jump. When she asked what he was doing, he said, "Elias told me I can fly if I jump. That was enough." She packed the family into the car and drove away from the cabin that very afternoon. They never went back. For years the cabin sat abandoned, its windows shuttered, its porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Life moved on. Mark and Tommy grew older. Their mother rarely spoke of the cabin, and when she did, her face hardened, as though she was remembering something she refused to explain. Then came the inheritance. When their mother passed away, the cabin became theirs. Mark, now with a wife and young son of his own, decided it was time to reclaim the place. To prove that childhood fears were just that fears. So one summer, he brought his family back. The cabin smelled of dust and mildew. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the floor groaned with every step. But with a little work, it was livable. His wife hung curtains, his son played in the yard, and for a moment, Mark almost convinced himself the past was behind him, until the third night, Mark's 5-year-old son came down from the loft, rubbing his eyes, and said something that made Mark's blood run cold. "Daddy, I made a new friend. His name is Elias." At first, Mark froze. Then he forced a smile, told himself it was coincidence. Kids have active imaginations, after all. Maybe his son had heard the name in a story, but the details grew eerily familiar. His son whispered about games Elias wanted to play, about how Elias liked to sit in the dark corners of the cabin, about how Elias didn't like Daddy very much. One night, Mark woke to find his son standing on the balcony rail, swaying slightly, ready to leap. When Mark grabbed him and pulled him back, the boy screamed, "Let me go. Elias says I can fly." That was when Mark made the decision. The very next morning, he packed up his wife and child, just as his mother had done decades before. But this time, curiosity gnawed at him. He called his brother Tommy, now an adult, and told him what had happened. Tommy's reaction was strange. He didn't laugh, didn't dismiss it. He just grew quiet and finally said, "I don't remember much about the cabin. I don't remember Elias." But his voice shook when he said it, like maybe he remembered more than he was willing to admit. Mark never went back. The cabin still stands, crumbling deeper into the forest with every passing year. Hunters who pass by claim feels wrong, as though the air itself grows heavier the closer you get. Some say the cabin is cursed. Others say a tragedy happened there long ago, something erased from town records. No one knows for sure. What Mark does know is this: imaginary friends don't usually stay in the same place for generations. They don't follow families down through time. They don't whisper the same words to children decades apart, unless they aren't imaginary at all. And sometimes, when Mark tries to sleep, he still hears the echo of his son's voice in the dark. "Elias doesn't like you, Daddy." Maybe you're thinking these are just stories, just coincidences, exaggerations, tricks of memory. But if you talk to the people who lived through them, if you see the way their eyes shift when they remember, you'll realize something. They believe every word. A woman hunted across the dark shore of Table Rock Lake. A writer who swears footsteps followed him in a cabin that should have been empty. A family in the Black Hills whose silence is more terrifying than violence. A stalker who turned a mountain hideaway into a trap of fire and smoke. And a name whispered in Allegheny for generations, Elias, still waiting in the shadows of a Rotting cabin, 5 stories, different places, different people. But the same truth runs through them all. The wilderness keeps secrets. So the next time you find yourself in the mountains, or deep in a forest far from home, and the night grows too quiet, remember this: you may not be alone. And if you ever hear a voice calling your name from the darkness, don't answer.
Thank you for following.